Greetings, grade 12s. So we are now moving on to our new section, which is genetics. So we're still within the DNA section of, sort of the life at a molecular level, that strand. But now we're moving on to a completely new concept, which is genetics. So we finished off with DNA, protein synthesis, meiosis, all of those things. We are now moving on to genetics. So what I decided to do is I decided to make the first video just going through all the main terminology that you need to know, because I think of all the sections, genetics is probably, genetics and genetic engineering are the most difficult from a terminology perspective that you need to know. So we really need to make sure that we have a solid understanding of this terminology before we can even go forward into something like the history relating to genetics and the applied nature of genetics that you need to understand. So please, this video, you really have to go over again, rewind, pause, listen, write down, make sure you are very comfortable with A, knowing what all these terms mean, and B, being able to describe them yourself in your own words from a definition or explaining type of instruction verb from that perspective. Okay, so this is a very important video. So let's get into it. First of all, what is genetics? This thing that we are going to be studying. So if we were to define this word, genetics is the study of heredity and the variation of inherited characteristics. Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. What do I mean by heredity? Heredity is the passing on of traits genetically from one generation to the next. So remember we talked about the whole protein synthesis and proteins, the things that make us who we are, what we look like, how we function, that is all contained within our DNA. The DNA is this code of life. It is this recipe book that tells us this is how you are supposed to create each of your things. So when we, as animals, when we do sexual reproduction, we are combining the genes, as we did with our meiosis, to pass it on to the next generation. So genetics is then the study of how are these things passed on from generation to generation. And then the second part of this sort of what is genetics is knowing about the variation of these inherited characteristics. Because remember, we are not clones. We are not exactly the same as each other. We are different. Yes, you can look at me as being a human. We all know that we are human when we look at each other, or whatever an animal is, but we know that there is differences between us. So understanding these differences and how they occur is part of genetics. So, the first real sort of terminology thing is what do we study in genetics? And that is genes. These things called genes. So what is a gene? So the gene is the unit of inheritance. So that's one way of describing it. So we're talking about the study of heredity, the study of this inheritance. Well, what then are we looking at specifically? It's the gene. Don't think of it as like a monomer, because it's not like we combine then genes to form a macro gene kind of thing. That's the wrong way to think of it. Basically, if we were to break a gene down even further in terms of its structure, we would then be looking at a nucleotide, but that's not what we're interested in this section. In genetics, we look at the gene. So, if we were to then describe it further, we could say that it is a short sequence of nucleotides found on the DNA that codes for one trait or characteristic. So the word trait and characteristic are interchangeable in this whole section, really. So if I was to visualize this, if you look here, I've got a picture of a chromosome. Remember, the chromosome is the condensed version of the DNA. If I was to uncoil this and uncoil, I would get the double-stranded DNA that we've discussed with our nucleotides and our letter sequences. But if I was to take just this pink section, so the letter sequence from the beginning of the pink section to the end of this pink section, that whole area there represents one gene. And essentially, it's what we're saying is this section will code for one protein. That's what we're really looking at. But remember, it can be other things. There's also the regulatory things, the gene for this particular regulatory thing. But if you want to think of it as the easiest version, we're looking for the coding of one protein. to make it slightly easier for you guys. That represents one gene, that section of nucleotides, a short section of nucleotides on this whole DNA strand. So that is the gene. Now, like I said, we are human. If you were to look at yourself in the mirror, then your parents and your friends and anyone else who's around you, you would obviously know that we are human. But we know that we are all different from each other in small ways or small proteins that are slightly different. So, we then talk about alleles. Or sometimes you look at a video, they say allele, allele, however you want to say it and however you're going to remember to spell it. But the allele is the different versions of a gene. So remember, one gene codes for one protein. But we are not all the same in that those proteins are exactly similar. And the best way to illustrate this is with the most classic examples of eye color and hair color. So yes, all humans have an eye. And all humans have an iris. But the color of that iris is different. So the gene is eye color. But the alleles will be brown, blue, emerald or green, gray, black, purple, maybe when we're talking about albinos. So those are the different versions of the gene of eye color. Similarly, we can look at hair color. So we as humans, we have hair on the top of our head, but the versions of the color of that hair could be blonde, red, ginger, brown, black, those kind of things, and variations within those colors. So again, the gene is that you have hair and it has a color. The versions of that gene is then the alleles. Okay, you with me so far? We're doing okay. So you as a human are obviously made up of many, many, many different proteins, and therefore many, many genes. So where are these genes located? Because we can't just have these genes moving around, shifting places, because we need to be able to know where to find them. So that's where the term locus comes in. So what does locus kind of sound like? It sounds like location, which is basically what it is. It is the fixed position on a chromosome where a gene is located. So if I was to look at this picture here, so this is, for example, chromosome 1. It doesn't necessarily have to be, I'm just saying for example. And this is the homologous paired chromosome 1 as well. Remember, you get one chromosome 1 from your father, one chromosome 1 from your mother, or the mother side. But this gene, for example, which has been highlighted here, is the gene for flower color. So the color of the flower is this particular gene. This chromosome has the allele for purple flowers, and this chromosome has the allele for white flowers. But they are both located in the same place. So the way that we generally can describe the locus is in two ways. So number one, you will notice on this particular chromosome there is a short piece and a long piece. So the first way that we identify the locus is on the long arm or the short arm of the chromosome, as in like an arm, the arm that you have a hand on. That's what we refer to as. We can also then more specifically describe it between exact nucleotide places. So remember, there will be a set number of nucleotides in this sequence. So I can say that the locus for this is on the long arm between nucleotide 3607 to 4205, depending on how long that particular sequence is and where it exists on the actual chromosome. Don't worry too much about those exact numbers. You do need to remember long arm and short arm. Those are important ones that we need to know when we describe those. Okay, so that is the locus. Where is it located? So as I said, if you think about this picture here, you are many, 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 many genes stacked on top of each other. So, genome. Genome is the complete set of genes or genetic material present in a somatic cell of an organism. The complete set of DNA of an organism. So if I was to take a somatic cell and extract all the DNA from that somatic cell, I would then have all the recipes, all the instructions needed to create a human, for example. So all the genes that you have inherited, not just for one trait, for all the traits of being a human, all of those genes are referred to as your genome. So if I was to extract all the DNA from a somatic cell, that would be your genome. So I've had gene for one trait, genome, all the genes that you have inherited. We can take this concept even further and talk about the gene pool. So now I've gone beyond the individual and I'm looking in a population. So the gene pool refers to the total number and types of genes present within a population. So remember, if we think about our population dynamics, what is a population? It is a group of individuals of the same species inheriting the same area and interacting with each other. So within a particular area, all the individuals that can potentially interact with each other. So as a very quick example, let's say that this is a population of frogs. These are all the frogs that can potentially interact with each other. They're in one particular space. There's no way that they're going to come into contact with any other frogs. Do we notice that we have green frogs, purple frogs, and red frogs? So the pool of colors, the pool of alleles that I can potentially have for these frogs will only be green, purple, and red. There is no chance of any other color occurring besides from a mutation, like a random mutation occurring, but that is the potential that we have. We can't assume with mutations what will happen from there. Yes, we can tell that within this population, the green color is much more prominent, with the red being the least available. So the chance that you're going to have a red frog is much less because the number of that particular gene is very low. So if we talk about humans, for example, we could say that all the humans on the whole planet, technically, is our gene pool. Technically. Again, that would depend on how much access you have. If you can get on a plane and fly to any country, you have access to that population's gene pool. If you are isolated for some reason, you don't have access, you are confined, you are restricted in terms of your movement, that would then decrease the availability of genes present that you can work with. Now, this becomes very important when we start discussing evolution, when we look at the difference between a small gene pool and a large or big gene pool. We will discuss this a little bit more in depth when we go into evolution, but just bear in mind that obviously a small gene pool will have low genetic diversity versus a big gene pool which is going to have a high genetic diversity. So the problem with a small gene pool is that you have a higher risk of extinction because you have a lower ability to resist external change versus a large gene pool. The more genes you have available, the more variations, the greater your chance of resisting external change. Okay, I'm going to pause it there for 1 second. For one video. We're going to leave it here. I'm going to carry on with the terminology after this. So make sure you have an understanding of these first, and then I'm going to go into part 2 of terminology after this. Thanks very much, guys.